I'm going to talk a little bit about two different ways I think we could think about the question of how demography did. And one is, how did particular researchers do at using tools of demography to aid our understanding of the pandemic? And I think we did well on that front as a field. And the other is, how did demographic institutions, especially those associated with publishing, do? And I think we did less well there in ways that are worth thinking about for the future and thinking about what we want our publications, and especially our flagship publications in the field, to be able to do when social crises happen. So in terms of the research contributions that demographers made, I thought I would just rattle off a few of them that seem especially important to me in kind of widespread understanding of what exactly was happening with the pandemic, where demographers, I think, made influential contributions. And the first is the kind of one of many points that you might think is a kind of demography 101, that age matters. And at this point in the pandemic, I think that that is widely appreciated by many, many people, including in the sort of like literate public, not just in research communities. But I think that was less true early on. And it was actually very important for people like Jen Beam-Dowd and others at Oxford to make this point in the context of international comparisons, that if you want to understand why one population is being harder hit than another, that if you don't adjust for age, you're kind of just asking which population is older than another, and that meaningful comparisons had to be made in a way that was adjusted or that otherwise reflected the age distributions of the populations. So I think that was a really important contribution. And actually, I think a lot of the trickiest ongoing questions in the pandemic, even though that point has been well appreciated, still center on that question and related questions about population composition. So as an example, when we're trying to understand how vaccines are holding up in different contexts, one of the biggest challenges is that population age, vaccine timing, and thus at any given moment, the time since the latest vaccine, and the variants that are circulating in the population, all three of those are heavily conflated with each other in complicated ways. And that makes it really difficult to use real-world observational data to understand how the virus is evolving, how the vaccines are working. And so those are things where the kind of demographic obsession with thinking about population composition, and particularly thinking about age, because we have such structured ways of incorporating it into our analyses, I think has been really important and still has a lot to offer. Another kind of contribution has been the kind of precise modeling of implications of particular scenarios. So I'm thinking here of things like the paper that Josh and Ken and Thomas Cassidy did about age structures of vaccination, where they said, you know, it seems really intuitive to think that if you want to save the most lives possible, like the most, sorry, not the most lives, but the most lifetime, so the most life years possible, that there might be kind of a trade-off between at older ages, more people are at risk, but at somewhat younger ages, you're going to save more life per life saved. And so what does that trade-off imply? And finding out that the answer in any sort of realistic COVID scenario, that where age is the only structuring variable, is no, you should still actually focus on the oldest people. That was counterintuitive to me. I think that's been counterintuitive to many people. And that's an important insight that I think only demographic modeling could actually get to. So that's another kind of example. A third one that is sort of demographic bread and butter to me is this kind of careful measurement of core concepts that should inform pandemic policy, like excess mortality and life expectancy, where, you know, our field has sort of a leg up on measurement, but also on interpreting what these things actually mean, especially life expectancy. That's so counterintuitive. But I am particularly struck by there's so many papers from, you know, epidemiology and other fields that make really important contributions, but the measurement is all framed around one particular research question that they're asking. And then what gets reported is, here's a measure that is only reported in connection with a particularly idiosyncratically chosen set of covariates that happen to be what was available in a data set that happened to match a particular research question. And then that's all the information that you have. And I think demographers like the team of Andrew Stokes and Irma Elo and Sam Preston and some others that have produced these excess mortality estimates by county, I think has been really helpful for here's the actual data, and then you can do different things with it. So for example, the finding that emerged from their work that counties that had more Trump vote were also counties where there was a bigger gap between excess mortality and official COVID mortality. In other words, where there were more deaths that were not being officially called COVID, but really spiked up during the pandemic. That's a really important finding that was not, not just what they set out to find, and not the only thing that you can do with this thing that they created for the world to let us see excess mortality at the county level. Another one, I'm going to ask the students here if anyone knows. So I'm in Minnesota and I've been working with state vaccination data, and here our state vaccination data say that the percentage of Black and Asian American people above age 65 who are fully vaccinated in Minnesota is above 100%. And I've seen similar things in New York City. I've seen similar things in Florida. Does anybody know why this could be happening? There's actually more than one reason, although I think I know which one it is in Minnesota.
Responses from some of the workshop participants? I'll take a guess. We're seeing some on the chats. Double vaccination, migration.
These are both very good guesses that I think are both happening in some places. I don't think at misreporting of race. All of these are actually very plausible. I think there's something else that in Minnesota at least is decisive. Vaccine mandate. Oh, so like people are saying that they're vaccinated when they're not. I'll tell you what I think it is. And I could be wrong, but actually I'm pretty confident about this in the Minnesota case. I'm not sure how much this is exactly what's going on in, say, Florida, where I think double vaccination and migration are really relevant. I think it's that the state has an accurate, so the way these vaccination rates are calculated, the state has a count of who has gotten vaccinated that come from vaccine reporting. And then to make that into a rate, they need a source of population data. And so they're using the population data that have been available, which are out of date. And in Minnesota, the Black and Asian American populations that are old have been rapidly growing because these are growing and aging populations. And if you use out-of-date denominators, you will underestimate the population size, and then you will overestimate the rate. The reason I'm so confident that that's what's going on in Minnesota, well, one reason is that actually in my own work on COVID, I used kind of outdated denominators in too cavalier a way in some of my early work. And then we realized hey, this actually matters a lot. It matters much more than I expected because some of the populations are growing and aging so rapidly. And so we started paying a lot more attention to estimating better denominators to get it right. Actually, Magali at the Berkeley Population Center was really helpful in one of our main papers at doing some kind of really innovative stuff to help us get accurate denominators before they were otherwise available. But so that's also a kind of demography 101 point to me, that denominators really matter. And I think that point is still underappreciated including in official data because we use the denominators that we have. So the last point to me about where demography has made these kind of intellectually important contributions to understanding the pandemic is our emphasis on descriptive facts. So I'm thinking about things like the work by Emily Smith Greenaway and Ashton Berdery and others about that's just answering the question, when someone dies of COVID, how many people have experienced the loss of a parent or a child or a sibling or another close kin? And so they call these COVID kin multipliers. But that kind of information that just helps us translate numbers that are more easily accessible, like how many people have died, into what's closer to the human reality of what are people actually experiencing in the population, I think is really important. And in my own COVID work, basically the way that I have approached it has been to try to say, what are the descriptive facts that I can find that have important moral or ethical implications? So there's not a lot of like fancy, the technique is just getting the description right, but there's not a lot of fancy causal modeling in anything that I've done in the pandemic, right? It's just description. And then thinking about what the description means. So I think our field, I feel proud of all these intellectual contributions that I think demography as a whole has made, because they reflect what I see as our sort of core intellectual strengths. And this was a context where those strengths really mattered, in my opinion. I think that our institutions maybe did less well. So to me, the most conspicuous is that our prestige journals are way too slow. So none of the core COVID work that I am thinking of, and I'm probably forgetting some, but none that I can think of was published in demography, PDR, population studies. Demographic research, which has a different publishing model, did publish some important things, but fundamentally our journals are just too slow. So we were really lucky as a field that PNAS, especially early in the pandemic, I think effectively served as like our replacement journal for the things that demography could have done. And it's just lucky that there are PNAS editors who are demographers and could, understood the value of this work. But so one consequence of our journal's failure is that demographers have tended to publish in the journals of other fields, epidemiology, health policy, and so on. And that has benefits in terms of like broadening our reach, but it also maybe has some weird consequences for our field. Like I read demography journals, I miss a lot of the I read other journals as I see them, but not in the same way, right? So I miss a lot of the work that demographers are doing. And then that has these sort of weird cascading effects where I think it has actually amplified social media as a kind of mechanism for which work gets read and which doesn't in our core demographic networks. And I'm not sure that's really a great thing, even though I think I personally have benefited from it. But it doesn't actually strike me as like a good way for a field to figure out what's the important work that we're producing. And so I think there are some imaginable alternatives. Like I think there are things that demography as a journal in theory could have done to have faster review for certain kinds of articles. There is a reviewer crisis that's happening, but also I know that for about a year, I was reviewing about a paper a week because I felt a moral obligation to do that as a COVID researcher. Well, I would have loved to do that for demography, right? But instead I was doing it for like epi journals and so on. I also think you could imagine PAA playing a role where through the kind of like elected structure of PAA, you could have some appointed group of experts that would have some curated, like, here's the newsletter of what demographers have done this week on the pandemic that might have been helpful in amplifying and sort of sorting through the work that people were doing, allowed space for commentary and debate, and just kind of created more cohesion in our field's contribution. And then I think the last element of this for me is about the population centers, where I think like the fact that I was able to do COVID research at all early on was because of being at a pop center. The pop center facilitated putting me in connection with the person who had the COVID data, and that's where it all came from. But I also feel like I would have wanted my pop center to do a lot more than we did in that vein of sort of like thinking together about what can we collectively do to contribute to research in this area that we can't do individually or in small groups. And we didn't do that. And that partly reflects that in the pandemic, everybody's life was in crisis. So there's like a real limitation there that's, you can't, it doesn't make sense to just sort of wish that things had been different when everybody's life had real constraints. But to me, that just points to the question that I'll end with for everyone to think about is just, what does that mean for the next crisis? What are the things we should do now to set up our institutions so that we as a field can respond in a more coherent and fast way, even when everybody is individually reeling and, dealing with real things in their lives.
Great. Good. Okay. Over to you, Robert.
I'm sorry I missed your introduction, Ken. I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I was actually thinking about this. I would start off with, because this is a formal demography workshop, I would talk about the links between formal demography and the tools that we used during this COVID crisis. And I think that maybe you guys already discussed this, and so I'm repeating, but in case you haven't, I'll say that that early on, one of the most compelling things that people were talking about was R naught. And R naught is something that was actually formally transferred from demography into epi in, I think, 1979, 1980 by Anderson and May. And they expressly referred to R naught. They were saying that they were modeling it after the net reproduction ratio. So that was one piece of this modeling that I think we know a lot about these multipliers, R naught as a multiplier. I've always thought it was a little odd that one area where I think that in demography we spent a lot of time thinking about was not only the NRR, but also the mean generational length. So we could multiply them in order to get a growth rate R, because as you may recall, the NRR is equal to e to the R mu, or very close to it, is well approximated by e to the R mu. So that was one thing I think that we did well as formal demographers. Another thing that I think there was a deep connection between the stable population models you guys have probably learned about this week and the Lotka-Euler stable population formulation and the differential equation models that Kermack and McKendrick. Ken, you know this was like 1925, 1927, something like that. So it's almost 100 years since Kermack and McKendrick were coming up with these differential equation models. And they are the basis for much of the work done in EPI on SIR and other kinds of models. And then there's this close connection between the Lotka-Euler integral models, the Leslie-Berndelli matrix models, and these differential equation models that are used in EPI. And I think it was Kiefitz, was it Nathan Kiefitz who first showed that these three things were the same, Ken?
Well, at least in the public domain, yes.
There may have been others, but we know about it from Nathan. What I really wanted to say about this was that the reason why these models are useful. Let me back up one more second and say that many of you are probably familiar with George Bach's aphorism that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I've always thought that Sam Carlin's summary of models is better. And what Sam Carlin says is that the purpose of models is not to fit the data, but to sharpen the questions. And I think that the big advantage that we as demographers, especially as formal demographers, the big advantage we have is that we have these models that help us to frame questions. And I think that the work that Ken and Josh were doing that got published in PNAS. Elizabeth was talking about PNAS was really great about publishing things quickly, asking about the oldest old and who should be vaccinated. But even more so, because of these models, Elizabeth, Ken, by the way, just have to say, Ken sent us an email a couple of days ago saying that we should cite our most intriguing papers that we did not write. So Elizabeth could not say this, but I can, which is that I think one of the best articles that's been published in the last 2 years about this is written by Elizabeth. I'll say Elizabeth right there. And that was her paper in PNAS. She has actually, did you have 2 papers in PNAS? No, it was one. And where she was asking this question about the differential effects. And I think that one of the things that we as formal demographers do quite well is to ask questions that our models pose for us about differential effects that have more to do with characteristics that not everyone thinks about. And so she was asking a question, not just about age, not just about sex, but she was also asking about differential consequences by ethnicity. And I think that those are really great. In terms of failures, I also shared this with Ken and Andrew and Elizabeth. I have very mixed feelings. I think that one thing that we did poorly, let me back up and say one other thing that I think we did well before I flip into what we did poorly. I think that Elizabeth just mentioned that one of the things that that was very helpful is having the proper denominators. And I think that one place where we did quite well is in, and this is close to my heart, it's how the HMD, the Human Mortality Database, came out with a short-term fluctuation database very, very quickly. And that has allowed us to look at excess mortality. Unfortunately, it's only in the developed world, but it has given us a way to ground our estimates of excess mortality much more firmly than many other data sets. And it has made us think about what is excess mortality and how will we measure what the baseline is. And I think that was done very well. Now, coming back to where I think that we dropped the ball, I think, and I think we didn't pivot as quickly as we should have. And Andrew, I'm sure, feels this way, that we did not. I think that part of this is that we are such academics. We don't like to go out and say things before we're sure. But in the time of a crisis, sometimes you need to take a stand. And this was a crisis. And I don't think that we pivoted quickly enough to handle misinformation. And an interesting perspective for me is that I spend my time between the US and France. And I feel like there may have been more misinformation in English than there was in French. And, but I haven't, that's my impression. But I think that we were spending more time in English trying to fight misinformation than French demographers were spending in French fighting misinformation. And that's my impression. I have to work through all of that and think more deeply about it. But I think that's the place where we dropped the ball. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Robert. Perfect lead in to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Ken. And Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers of this conference and thank you for inviting me, and thank Ken for the introduction and my fellow panelists. Ken, I sent you an email in which I said I was proposing to talk mostly about really something that that Robert just touched on, which is interfacing with the public, and you didn't
I didn't
respond to that. So
yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so but I mean the talks that have gone in a perfect order, really, because I mean Elizabeth highlighted, you know, what I think are most of the important contributions of formal demographers, and I endorse you know, what she said, and Robert as well. I mean, your talk really made me nostalgic, Robert, for what got me into demography, which was, you know, my master's thesis on measles, Kermack-McKendrick models of a transmission, and I quoted that Nathan Kiefitz's piece for like the part of the thesis where it's like, how is this demography and not just epidemiology? And so, you know, you really, I don't see demography and epidemiology necessarily having like clear black and white borders. I mean, they're both population sciences. You know, demography focuses more on storks and grim reapers and spaceships, and that's a Berkeley joke. So ask your friends about it after if you don't get it. And you know, epidemiology focuses more on the microbes. Sometimes a little too much on the microbes, and I've tried to pull epidemiologists sometimes by their hair to understand that, you know, that you cannot understand a pandemic without understanding the people part of it. But I've spent the last 26 months mostly talking to the press, because what happened is this pandemic kicked off, and I was on this very early. I mean, in December, January of 2020, I was warning people about that this was going to be a very big deal.
About duct taping your underpants.
Duct taping your underpants. It's still my pinned tweet. So for those of you who know what Twitter is or are on Twitter, you can find out. You can go to my Twitter. In January of 2020, I tweeted, "Duct tape your underpants, coronavirus." We didn't call it COVID yet. The term COVID hadn't been coined. But the thing is, I'm a demographer who principally studies mortality, and so I was like, you know, it's going to be years before we have all the right data sets to really understand the mortality of this. And so, and I'm a noted skeptic of you know, having tried my hand at some of these models myself, that the SEIR models were going to sort of save us from calamity. You know, I know there are mixed emotions about that, you know, in the field, but you know, the late great David Friedman was the external examiner on my PhD thesis, after all, and so, you know, a certain amount of skepticism towards models is kind of baked into the cake of my outlook on life, or on what we do professionally. So I didn't think SEIR models were going to save us, and the early IHME models were a Gaussian, or a normal curve, where the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is incidence of COVID. And now, such models actually have a history in our field. Brownlee published these in the Royal Proceedings of the Royal Society in 1910. But we've abandoned them for good reason. I mean, a normal curve is a probability distribution function, where some quantity is on the horizontal axis and the frequency is on the vertical axis. It's a histogram. And so to use Poisson as to use a normal curve as a time series device is really requires like a leap of faith. But even as late as I think May 2020, IHME was still publishing epidemic curves that followed the normal curve. So I mean, there's a world, and some of the previous panelists have talked about this. There's just a world of stuff out there. Some of it good, some of it really foolish.
IHME, Institute for Health Metrics,
and evaluation. Yes.
For the workshop participants.
Okay. Yeah.
Seattle group. That was really all over the press early on.
That's right.
About.
Yeah, there's a think tank in Seattle, which has some loose affiliation with the University of Seattle, but is not sort of wholly a part of it. So I kind of, for all of these reasons, I kind of pivoted to communication with the public. And here, I think I'd like to think I've had some impact, but also I'd like to sound kind of a more sour note than the first two panelists. And so firstly, I've been quoted, as Ken said, in the Atlantic, but also in every major newspaper, internationally and nationally. I've been, UC Irvine keeps tabs on my press appearances, and I think it's over 1,000 at this point in the pandemic. And my colleagues at the university were kind enough to give me a campus-wide award for service to the university for all the press work I did. I don't normally like to brag, but anyway, it was nice of them to recognize the work I've done. There were days when I was on the phone to a journalist for 8 hours straight. And it was, to the point where I was hoarse at the end of the day. I think it's important because of the earlier point I mentioned that pandemics are society, not just microbes, that we involve society in communicating our best scientific knowledge and practice to them. And here I think, largely there's been a lot of failures. And this is maybe less narrowly tailored to demography as a science, but science as an edifice. The prior panelists talked about age structure, and today in the New York Times, there's a piece on how minorities in America aren't doing so badly with COVID, but there's no age stratification, and it's actually quite misleading. And so there would be an example where our specific science, should be applied more accurately. Let me see. Everyone, yeah, correct, Elizabeth. Thank you for that comment.